welcome to Share Truth Apply Scripture. I'm Jordan Chambly, joined by Wesley Wildman, and Abraham Hamilton is our guest today. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to be talking about the role of government.
So don't cut it off.
Don't cut. I know you're like, oh, politics. I hear this all the time on AFR. I don't want to. No. Anyway, so we're going to talk about that. Why is this so difficult to talk about in the church setting? And should it be, and how should it be addressed? So, Abraham, why don't you just introduce yourself to our listeners real quick?
Sure. Abraham Hamilton III here. I serve as the General Counsel for the American Family Association, and I host a radio program Monday through Friday, 5 to 6 p.m. Central, on the American Family Radio Network called The Hamilton Corner.
Yeah, well, that's great. And
that's a good introduction.
Yeah, and you can check him out on AFR as well. So
AFR.net, you can go there. You'll find his podcast there. He's got a short commentary that's about a minute and a half or about a minute. And then he's also got an extended program that he airs daily on American Family Radio and also Urban Family Communications, Urban Family Talk.
Yeah, so if you haven't been following this series, what we're doing is we have 5 subjects that have not been addressed correctly or to the degree that they should have been.
Or at all
in the culture and for Christians specifically.
And I'll just go back over there. So you've got, we discuss secret sins.
Mm-hmm. Secret sins,
just in general, generally speaking.
Yeah, all right.
Having a secret sin and how to handle it, how to deal with it, and how to put that thing to death and give it over to the Lord. But also how it can infiltrate if you let it go, regardless of whether other people know about it. God knows about it.
Right.
That's right.
Then we talked about depression. We talked about suicide. We talked about homosexuality was last week. Those are the 4, and then government this week. And this was inspired because sitting in my church about a year ago, it gave us a heads up and said 5 things that you don't talk about in church, and we're going to talk about them. And it was these 5 things, and I thought, man, it'd be neat to do a series on these because I know in my conversations with my friends, millennials, that are millennials, these topics are not discussed publicly often enough at least. And then obviously from the pulpit, we can look and give many examples on because they're not discussed why we are where we are. So we want to do what we always do. We want to provide you the problem, and we're going to give you the solution too. So, Jordan?
Yeah, and so getting into this discussion on government, and but we have to understand that government's not something that we created. Man did not create government. God created government. It's an institution that He put in place in Genesis, really, when there was consequences for sin, when there was consequences for murder. By man's blood you will be shed if you shed man's blood. That was the institution of government. And so we have to understand that this is not something that is not important. It is important. It's not something that we can be neutral on as Christians. God has a stance on government. And in Romans 13, he tells Christians that you have to be submissive to the governing authorities. You can't just be a group of people out there who say, oh, no king but King Jesus, and completely disregard the institution of government. Yeah. So we have to understand that going in. So why don't we open up with in what ways has the church failed to address the subject of politics and address the subject of being involved in the government?
Yeah, I think part of the reason why it's come to that place in our modern times is the whole creation of the 501c3 movement and the effort to in an inaccurate way to apply understanding of separation of church and state, which is quite frankly a violation of our Constitution, as well as a misunderstanding of what that phrase actually means, the context for it, and all. I guess I'll do a little brief.
No, good. That's what we're here for. Yeah.
Because people talk about that. Well, we're in America. We have separation of church and state.
Yeah.
Dude. But the fact is we do, but the way that it's used in contemporary times is misunderstanding. So that phrase, those 8 words, actually were included. There were 8 words in a dialogue between Thomas Jefferson and a group of Baptist Christians in Danbury, Connecticut. It began with the Danbury, Connecticut Baptists writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1801 following the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788, saying that, I see this Constitution thing has been ratified, but how would that impact us as a local group of Christians? And Thomas Jefferson responded with an entire letter explaining that here in America, there's a separation of church and state that prohibits the state from invading into the parameters of the church, and not vice versa.
Quite
way
the opposite.
The way you know that is that from the very instance of the creation of the federal government to where we stand today, you have chaplains in Congress. You
Yes.
have consistent interplay between
That's right.
Christians and faith and government.
That's right.
The purpose of that phraseology was to convey to the Danbury Christians, and as well as all Americans, that the government has no lawful authority to intrude upon the province and the jurisdiction, if you will, of the church.
Wow.
And there is a very that what he just explained, Abe just explained, goes into great details on a link that's on Wall Builders, and we'll include that at the bottom in our show notes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting with the historical context of that statement too. Is very important because you understand where they came from, or their fathers and grandfathers came from in England. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, and before that the Catholic Church, when that was in power, was so intrusive on any other form of religion in that area.
theocracy.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
whatever religious faith that the monarch
That's
adhered
right.
to, that
Right.
was a requirement of all the constituency of the Commonwealth.
And that flies in the face of the character of God being coercive to religion or
Yeah.
Christianity.
Yeah, and understanding the context of that letter, prior to 1947, those 8 words had never been quoted out of context.
Yeah.
Any
They were
court
inclined
case
to.
or anything, they would refer to the entire exchange between Jefferson
Sure.
and the Danbury Baptists. But in the efforts with secular humanists attempting to advance their nefarious agenda, began to take those 8 words out of context
Right.
and made them mean something that they never were intended to mean.
So a couple things we've established so far. Jordan, you pointed out very well that God established government all the way back in Genesis and reaffirmed in Romans chapter 13 and other places. I'll read from 2 Timothy chapter 2 in a little bit. So reaffirmed, God established it, and then modern days, the reason we get a lot of the misconceptions that we get is the misinterpretation of separation of church state, because I've had millennial friends that love Jesus with a passion, and they just get that one. They've got it wrong. Now, I would encourage you to go read up. We'll provide the link at the bottom and understand exactly what Abe's talking about, the purpose and the original intent of the phrase separation of church and state. Because when I was able to articulate that with one of my friends, he didn't say at the moment that he's like, okay, I get it, I'm on your side on that one. However, you could see there was a lot of confusion. He was ignorant on that,
Right.
and so being able to articulate that, share that, I inspired him to go read that himself. And you can make incremental changes in people's worldview in their life if you're always prepared to give an answer. So
Right.
go check that out.
So so we've established those 2 points, that the government was established by God, but also that the separation of church and state misunderstanding that's become a myth in our culture now. So moving forward,
silence Christians
yeah,
a lot of the time.
silence Christians, to keep them from being effective in the way God calls us to be
Sure.
effective in our culture. So going forward, reclaiming that lost ground is what we should be doing. How do we do that in the context of a church? Because and I would actually say that I do struggle with this question too, because it seems to me that when a preacher goes up into the pulpit, his first priority 100% is to preach the gospel.
Okay.
Is to
That's
preach
fair.
the gospel. And so how does one appropriately go about this subject in a church setting?
Sure.
Is there a
Good.
prescription for this?
Well, yeah, it's the Bible.
Yeah.
And I'll
Good
be
answer,
more, and
Eddie.
I'll be more specific.
Yeah,
I
sure.
think one of the ways we get into trouble, because anything, good things, especially good things, we can make idols out of.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
we can make idols out of our children. We can make idols out of lots of things, just like we can make idols out of politics. And I think the danger that is present is when politics is severed from the Great Commission. When Jesus' instructions were, yes, proclaim the gospel, but also to make disciples. Acts 17:26, the Lord has determined before time the boundaries of our habitations and determine the times in which we would live. So when we understand God's sovereignty, his intent in making us, placing us at the time that we live, even in the nations that we live, we're all a product of God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
So when we consider that the Lord has mandated his disciples to execute the Great Commission, and we recognize what the Lord has given us the blessed privilege of being disciples of his in the nation of America, well, guess what we inherit? A nation that is governed by the people, for the people, at the will of the people. So it is the duty of the Christian to use everything at our disposal to advance the Great Commission. And in this particular instance, it is because we are followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. We take every opportunity to make an inroads where we can for the kingdom's sake. And so I'll just give a couple of examples, because the constant question I get is if our mandate is to preach the gospel and make disciples, well, changing policies, changing laws don't result in changes in men's hearts. And I've said, well, Galatians 3:26 talks about the law being a schoolmaster prior to somebody's heart being ready to receive full submission to Jesus Christ and being indwelled by the Spirit of God. The law is a trainer of the heart, trainer of the conscience. And so I'll just give 3 quick examples where I'll say the law does change hearts. It just is not as immediate as an encounter and submission to Jesus Christ, but it does result in a change of hearts and minds of people over time. 1967, prior to the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case, you'd be hard-pressed to find people in America that felt like multi-ethnic marriages were something that should be pursued.
Right.
Following 1967, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who would actually say out loud, I don't think people from different ethnicities should be married. Changes in the law resulted in the change of the hearts, minds, consciences, and behavior in America. Next example, 1973. Roe versus Wade. Prior to 1973, you wouldn't even get people that would be willing to even discuss killing babies before that Supreme Court case. Following it, we now live in a place where a major political party talks about shouting the right to kill children. And then changes in the law resulted in the change of the national consciousness, hearts, and minds. Lastly, Obergefell, 2015, same-sex marriage. Prior to Obergefell, there were 31 states that changed their state constitutions or their legislative statutes to reflect one man, one woman marriage. Overwhelmingly.
Yeah. There were some states were up to 88. I'm getting chill bumps talking about it. It was up to 88 or 81% voted one man, one woman.
Following Obergefell, we've sped right past same-sex marriage. We're talking about transgenderism. Changes in laws always result in a change of hearts and minds of people over time.
You know, and I know. Well, we've got 50 seconds left here, but we're going to go to break and we're going to pick back up on the second half. But you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Then we're going to talk about that afterwards. We're called to both preach the gospel and live the gospel. And living the gospel is conveying and living out both, whether it's in politics and culture and in entertainment, in the church, and all aspects of life. We're called to be a light for Christ and to be an example for Him. Because we're here for a short time. It's a vapor, and we need to make the most use of it.
And in those, when you have that, legal systems, policies, or whatever, they can be impediments to that advance of the gospel.
Amen.
I mean, how can you convey the reality of the gospel message of Christ and marriage when we have a culture that believes, well, 2 men, 2 women can be married, 3 women, 2 men. It creates an impediment for the advancement.
And I'll give an example from my trip in India when we get back.
Yeah, sure. And so stay tuned for that. Follow us after the break, and we'll be right back.